Hello everybody, welcome. Great to see you. I'm Ben Powell, I'm the director of the Free Market Institute here at Texas Tech, and this is our final public lecture of the semester. And before I introduce our speaker, I will just briefly introduce what we have coming up for the spring semester. On January 22nd, we have Amity Schlaze coming, who will be talking about the Great Society and her book on that. We have Nobel laureate James Heckman coming in February, on February 12th. And then on May 4th, at the end of the semester, we have Phil Graham, who will be coming to talk about his new book on economic freedom and what's going on in the United States today. And I think our former Chancellor, Kent Hance, who's buddies with him, is coming to that one too, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to do some sort of duet around that, but we'll see. But we all know, if you know Hance, you know he's going to do what he wants to do. But it should be interesting. Also, my colleague Adam Martin, almost unbeknownst to me, slipped in some other announcements into this that he wanted me to do for the undergrads in the audience. Our political economy reading program that he directs, the application deadline is tomorrow, and that'll be for the spring semester, and you meet twice a week for the first 6 weeks?
No, once a week next semester.
Once a week throughout the semester. It's a non-credit reading program, and discuss important ideas in political economy, and this time on topics of liberty and American economic history to coincide with the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States. And people who successfully complete this program get a $1,000 scholarship at the end of it. And also a new program that's been launched under Adam's leadership, classical liberal seminar, a summer seminar in classical liberal ideas that happens in Prague each summer. Application deadline for that is in February, and for that, rather than a scholarship you pay, but the $1,000 you pay covers your airfare, your lodging, and some of your meals there. Prague's a great place to be, even though it feels like Western Europe now compared to what it was 20 years ago. That's great for them, less interesting to tour, but still a great place to hang out and learn about these ideas in the summer. I'll start introducing our speaker, and Amanda can make sure that the slides work. So Mark Pennington is a professor of political economy and public policy at the Department of Political Economy at King's College London. He was head of the department between 2016 and 2020, which I gather he's happy to not be head of the department anymore. Prior to joining King's, he taught for 12 years at the School of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary, University of London. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's currently the director for the Center of the Study of Governance and Society. Mark and I were reminiscing that we first met each other in 2005 when we were both teaching at an Institute for Humane Studies summer seminar, not unlike the one that Adam is directing in Prague, except Mark and I were at Duke rather than Prague, and Prague would be more fun than Duke. I've been following his research ever since. He's the author of Robust Political Economy, Classical Liberalism, and the Future of Public Policy, Planning and the Political Market, and his most recent book, published earlier this year by Oxford University Press, which is what he's on his US speaking tour for, is Foucault and the Liberal Political Economy, Power, Knowledge, and Freedom, and he'll be talking to us about that project today. Mark, welcome to Texas Tech.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's wonderful to be here. This is a really new experience for me. The last few days I've been traveling around this amazing state in a car and experiencing a particular kind of freedom. We might get onto a little bit of that later on in my presentation. So what is the question that motivates the presentation I'm about to give and the book on which this presentation is essentially based? And the question is as follows. Is postmodernism compatible with the principles of market liberal political economy? So by postmodernism, I mean a philosophical position which is skeptical of universal truth claims, one that is skeptical of the relationship between science and government, and one that emphasizes the power exercised over individuals by narratives, or what postmodernists refer to as discourses. By market liberal political economy, I mean a social and economic theory that emphasizes the role of individual agency in influencing personal and social outcomes, and a normative political project that sees open markets as the best protectors of that agency from both public and private forms of power. Now, my answer to the question is yes, there is a compatibility between postmodernist concepts and those that inform market liberal political economies. We see this, what I would call postmodern liberal stream of thought, in thinkers such as Friedrich Hayek, Deirdre McCloskey, Ludwig Lachmann, George Shackle, and Don Lavoie. While these thinkers do not identify as postmodernists, there are important elements of their thought that merit calling them postmodern market liberals. Now, in this presentation and in my book, I argue that not only are these schools of thought compatible with each other, but that they can engage in a kind of dialogue that gives birth to a new form of political economic analysis, what I call a postmodern liberalism, that uses postmodern social theory to unmask various forms of illiberalism or overgovernment in contemporary societies, a form of overgovernment that is threatening increasingly market freedoms and indeed freedoms writ large. So this is quite a political book in many ways. It's political in the following senses. Many people often associate postmodernism with the ideas of the radical political left, which is often seen as hostile to market economies. What I'm arguing in this project is actually many of these ideas are compatible with the case for a radical market liberal individualism, and they can help proponents of that individualism understand the threats to the free society that exist in our societies today. What is it in our societies today that is threatening freedom? We can use postmodernist concepts to explore those threats. So in my presentation, in my book, I focus on the ideas of one of the leading, in fact the leading, postmodernist thinker, Michel Foucault. And there are two parts to my argument. So in the first part of the argument, I want to show you why the core ideas of thinkers like Foucault are compatible with market liberal principles. And then secondly, I want to show you how we can use this kind of synthesis to understand the threats to freedom that are unfolding in today's societies. So I'll start off in the first part of the presentation with this synthesis, and then I'll move on to show you how we can use this new framework to think about threats to freedom in the market economy and writ large in today's societies. Okay, so that's just the front cover of the book. We don't need to spend too much time on that. I want to start by looking at the first area where I think these sets of ideas are compatible. And this is on the relationship between the individual and society, or more specifically between the individual and culture. So I argue in the book that both these schools of thought, the postmodern school and the market liberal school, are united in what I would describe as a culturally situated individualism. So if we take Foucault, Foucault is famous for pronouncing what he refers to as the death of the subject. Now the subject is just a technical kind of fancy academic term, essentially for the individual. What do we mean by the individual? And why does he pronounce the death of the individual? Well, essentially it's because he argues that outside of some very thin biological parameters, there is no underlying human essence or human nature, and that there is no underlying true human rationality. For postmodernists such as Foucault, what we think we are, how we relate to others, and what we think is rational cannot be separated from the discourses, narratives, or conceptual frames, or what Foucault calls the regimes of truth that circulate in society and that exercise a kind of power over us as individuals. What we think we are on what we think is rational, according to this view, is an effect of what postmodernists call discourse power, the power of the narratives that shape the way in which we understand ourselves and the world around us. Now, crucially, for thinkers in this tradition, what Foucault refers to as discourse power has no author. Now, what does he mean by that? It's referring to the idea that there's no single point, there's no individual or group that we can trace this power to. It emerges, if you like, spontaneously from the interaction of multiple individuals who are attempting to exercise power and influence over other individuals. So we use language to try to influence other actors, and as we do that, linguistic norms or conceptual frames develop that actually shape our understanding of the world, our position in it, and of those around us. So this is, to use a technical term, an emergent phenomenon. We can't trace it to any individual or group, but nonetheless, this kind of cultural or discursive power exercises power over the way that we see the world. Now, very significantly, although in this view people are, in a sense, created by this kind of cultural power, they are not determined by it. They're not determined by it. They have the capacity to engage in what thinkers like Foucault refer to as acts of resistance, where people can challenge aspects of the culture that they're situated in, and through acts of, if you like, self-creation, they can challenge that culture to create something new and something different. So what Foucault and what postmodernists call resistance, we can think of as being a form of, if you like, entrepreneurial agency that all individual agents possess. Now, the people I refer to as postmodern liberals, and I include in this tradition thinkers like F.A. Hayek, Ludwig Lachmann, George Shackle, Don Lavoie, have actually a very similar view about the relationship between the individual and society. So for these thinkers, human preferences, what we value to a large extent, are endogenous. Okay? By that, they mean that they are the product of particular cultural situations. They don't sort of exist outside of some kind of a cultural setting. So for thinkers like Hayek, outside of a few basic preferences that everybody has for food, shelter, and sex, the values that we have are really created by the cultures in which we are situated. Okay, we are all born into what these thinkers describe as streams of tradition that we ourselves do not create. Okay, we're born into a set of practices or norms that shape the kind of values or preferences that we have. Even our rationality is actually shaped by tradition on this kind of a view. Okay, so what we think of as rational, even in the economic realm, does not pre-exist our culture. It actually emerges from the cultural situation in which we're situated. For thinkers like Hayek, it's actually the market economy and the process of contestation or competition that exists within a market economy that creates our understanding of what is and is not rational. Okay, there is no rationality, if you like, outside of the market system. The market produces our understanding of what is more or less rational. And this means that there is no universal homo economicus. Okay, there's no universal rational agent. What we consider to be rational varies across cultural settings and cultural contexts. On this view, very similar to the postmodern position, tradition and market structures that we're all born into have no author. Okay? They are emergent properties that emerge through a kind of process of imitative learning. We're all embedded in cultural norms and traditions that are not of our own making. They are emergent, or what Hayek calls spontaneous orders, the result of human action, but not of human design. Again, very similar to the postmodern view, although we are all the product of these traditions and market structures, we're not determined by them. We can engage in acts of entrepreneurial resistance against the cultural norms or market structures we find ourselves in, to morph them into something new or different. Now, what unites this kind of perspective with the postmodern view is a concern about the type of situations where this entrepreneurial resistance and the self-creation it allows for can be closed down or narrowed down. So for both of these traditions, there is no freedom, if you like, that exists outside of culture. Okay? But we can think of states of unfreedom as ones which arise in situations where cultures get frozen, where there are, if you like, cultural monopolies that develop, that block the process of entrepreneurial resistance or experimentation, and that prevent societies developing new norms and practices. This is a key theme that I emphasize in the book. Now let me turn to the next area where there is commonality between these traditions. And that is on a skepticism about the role that science plays in shaping the relationship between the individual and government. So both the postmodernists, such as Foucault, and the people I describe as postmodern liberals are skeptical of what they would refer to as the scientism of a great deal of contemporary social science. By scientism, they're referring to the idea that scientists can, if you like, study human societies and engage in a kind of experimental generation of knowledge by observing human participants. So you could think of scientism as a kind of stimulus response model of the human being. That we're all in a kind of laboratory, and experts will subject us to various stimuli, and that we will respond in predictable ways to that stimuli, and because of that, the scientists or the experts can manipulate society to produce desirable outcomes. Okay? That's what I'm referring to by scientism. Now, both people in the postmodern tradition and the people I would describe as postmodern market liberals are deeply skeptical of this kind of a view. They do not believe that people are like iron filings, okay, that just respond to stimuli of the kind that might be exerted by a magnetic field, because they are fundamentally creative agents, and that injects unpredictability into the social environment. What these traditions are concerned about is the way in which that creativity can be stifled by the application of these kind of scientific government techniques in our societies. So if we take the postmodern tradition first, thinkers like Foucault argue that many claims to scientific authority are a form of what he calls power knowledge. The attempt by various experts to actually seize power and influence in society by claiming to know either individuals, if you like, in their soul, or entire human societies. And through that knowledge, to put either individuals or human societies onto a better path. A path that's better for the individual and one that is better for society. Now there are two types of this kind of power that postmodernists such as Foucault refer to. Disciplinary power is a power that targets or tries to correct for actors who are described as deviant individuals. So this kind of power typically has been exercised against people who are considered to be insane. It can be exercised against people who might be described as criminal types. It's been exercised historically against gays and lesbians. Now this kind of power claims that by observing people, scientists can effectively get inside the soul of these deviant individuals and, through the application of a form of scientific knowledge, correct their behavior. Okay, so if you can understand the psychology of the criminal, you can correct the criminal's behavior. If you understand why people are homosexual, you can correct their homosexuality. If you can understand the soul of the insane, you can correct their insanity. So the key point about these techniques is that even if they don't actually work, okay, even if you can't actually correct these various actors, these various individual deviants in this way, you can exercise profound influence on how those actors see themselves by subjecting them to this kind of surveillance. The idea that there are experts who know you can influence how you see yourself as an actor. Okay, that's the critical point that's made here. Now, the second type of power that these thinkers refer to is what they call biopower. Whereas disciplinary power targets individuals and tries to correct their deficiencies or deviancies in some sense. What postmodernists call biopower targets entire populations. Okay? Instead of applying surveillance to the individual, it applies it to the whole of a human society. In the attempt to identify various disequilibria, which are considered to be in need of some form of correction. So what might those disequilibria be? Well, it could be a disequilibrium between the rate of births and deaths. People concerned that people aren't breeding enough. Okay. It could be concerned about lack of economic growth. It could be concerns about inequality. It could be concerns about people smoking too much or drinking too much. Okay, so the idea is you look for these disequilibria, and then you introduce inducements into your society, which in some sense will correct for the disequilibria. They'll bring about the desirable level of inequality. They'll bring about the desirable level of economic growth. They'll bring about the desirable level of people smoking or drinking or eating certain kinds of foods. This is the kind of notion that this idea of biopower gets at. Now, what matters on this kind of a view is that experts are in effect imposing a particular construction on the world. Okay? They're saying that they have the knowledge and the expertise to understand what these disequilibria are and actually to correct them in various ways. For example, by introducing various taxes or subsidies or regulations that will discourage certain forms of behavior and encourage other forms of behavior. Again, to emphasize, what matters on this view is that even if these classifications or the techniques that go with them don't actually work, they don't actually deliver the objectives that the scientists want, they can have a profound influence on how people see themselves. Okay, so do you see yourself as an actor who's capable of making decisions about the kinds of foods you should eat, or whether you should smoke, or whether you should have more children? Or do you see yourself as an actor who needs to be told what to do by other actors in order to bring about desirable social patterns? That is the critical point here. So these kind of classifications, if they become institutionalized, can effectively close down people's scope to be creative agents. Now, there's a great deal of similarity between this kind of criticism and the kind of arguments that thinkers like Friedrich Hayek make against scientism in the social sciences. So Hayek argues that human societies are not scientifically knowable entities. Okay? They're examples of what Hayek calls complex phenomena. By complex phenomena, he's referring to the idea that there are far too many variables in society for experts to fully comprehend. Variables that produce specific sorts of effects cannot be comprehended by some kind of godlike observing mind. You'd literally have to be God to understand all of the factors that actually produce the diversity of human experience. So scientific experts on this view cannot access this type of knowledge. When we're looking at examples of what the postmodernists call biopower, attempts to engage in economic planning or socio-economic regulation effectively impose a kind of classificatory grid on human societies that identify, if you like, plan-conforming and plan-deviant behaviors. They're a form of the very kind of thing that the postmodernists are concerned about. The classification of human beings into particular sorts of types that need to have their behavior corrected. This form of planning and regulation often operates through a form of government by statistics, where econometricians, governmental planners, various experts claim that through statistics they can know human societies and govern those societies to maximize human welfare. Well, thinkers like Hayek argue that that knowledge just doesn't exist. In many cases, the statistics do not actually represent the circumstances that individuals actually find themselves in. This kind of attempt to impose a sort of classificatory scheme on actors closes down their space to engage in entrepreneurship, to engage in creative destruction. Because entrepreneurial activity is inherently messy. Okay? It generates disequilibria. It's not neat and tidy. It's freedom. Okay? And freedom is messy. But scientific experts often want to, in a sense, make a society with tidy, bright lines, that is neat and tidy, that is compressed into grids of understanding that the experts or planners favor. Let me move on to the third area where there's commonality between these perspectives. And this is on the relationship between freedom and rights. So both the postmodernists, like Foucault, and the people I'm calling the postmodern market liberals, argue that rights are not neutral. Okay, when we say that people have rights, those rights are not neutral in terms of the kind of effects that they may have. Different kinds of rights constructions can either expand or close down the space within which people can exercise their agency or their freedom. Now, if we take the postmodernist tradition, first of all, they have looked at the non-neutrality of rights in the following way. So many people in this tradition are on the political left, and they complain in certain circumstances about the emphasis that classical liberals and libertarians place on the importance of protecting rights to person and property. So classical liberals or libertarians often subscribe to a negative view of freedom. Okay, the idea that you're free provided that nobody's taking your property and nobody's punching you in the nose unless you're in a boxing ring. Okay, it's that kind of an idea. Now, thinkers in this tradition argue that those kind of rights constructions ignore the way that in multiple other sites in society we can be subject to a form of interference or something that is bordering on coercion through cultural processes. Okay, so they will say that, well, people can be oppressed in the home. Okay, if you're a woman in a society which is telling you that you shouldn't go out to work, that's a kind of form of interference. Okay, it could be exercised in the home, in the workplace, in the education system, through religious institutions. If you're gay or lesbian, you might face various forms of prejudice in parts of society that narrow your space to be a free actor. So the suggestion is that negative rights leave people exposed to various forms of potentially oppressive action in society. But people such as Foucault are also skeptical of positive rights arguments. So what are positive rights arguments? Well, they come in two forms. One form is the idea that those people who perhaps have been oppressed by various kinds of cultural norms need to be given a certain kind of social status if they are to act as free agents. Okay? They also often claim, these kind of thinkers, that people need to be given resources to properly exercise their freedom. They need to be given more money if they don't have it. Now, for thinkers like Foucault, this is actually problematic, okay, because what's happening here is you are constructing a notion of the individual as essentially a passive actor. So if you say to people who have been oppressed by various kinds of social norms, you aren't capable of liberating yourself, you aren't capable of creating in your cultural environment an opportunity to widen your freedom, then what you're likely to do is create a passive agent who just waits for somebody else to improve their position. This is also true if you say to the poor, or those who've got relatively little opportunities, if you say to them, you've got no chance of becoming wealthier unless someone gives you the money, then what are those people likely to do? They're likely to wait to be given the money. They're not likely to exercise their freedom to be a creative agent. This is an example of how the discourse, the narrative, can actually impact in the way that people either exercise their freedom or fail to do so. But the other reason why some postmodernists are actually critical of positive rights ideas, which are usually associated with the left of politics, is precisely because in order to have a society where all of these kind of decentralized examples of power that are exercised over people are addressed, you would need a massive surveillance apparatus. Okay, you'd need surveillance in the home, in the workplace, in the university, in religious institutions, monitoring almost every aspect of what people are doing. So that in the name of freedom, you would in effect be closing down the space within which that freedom can actually be exercised. So Foucault, in his later writings, argues that the guarantee of freedom is freedom. Okay, people should, in a sense, just be left alone. Now, these arguments are actually very similar to those that are put forward by thinkers in what I call the postmodern or market liberal tradition. So for thinkers like Hayek, liberty upsets patterns. Okay, if you have a free society, then whatever cultural resources or economic resources you give to people, people will use in different ways, in ways that will continually upset patterns. If you're going to have a positive rights view that requires that people have a particular level of cultural status or a particular level of resources, you're going to have the state intervening right across your society. Okay, not just through the taxation system, but in the education system, in multiple other spheres of life. You will turn the state into what Alexis de Tocqueville described as a great tutelary power, which actually robs people of their freedom in the name of making them free. So on this view, negative rights are actually the biggest protection against what postmodernists describe as a normalizing society, a society that has multiple forms of surveillance. Now, what I want to do in the final part of my presentation is to tell you how, or to try to explain to you how, we can use this kind of synthesis that I've just presented to understand threats to freedom that are unfolding in today's societies, that are operating in what I would describe as a kind of silent road to serfdom, that operates through the narratives within which many of us live our lives. So in the second part of my book, I argue that many of today's so-called free market economies are actually becoming less free because we live in what postmodernists such as Foucault describe as biopolitical states. Now that's a technical sounding term. What does it actually mean? Well, it goes back to that idea of biopower that I referred to earlier in the presentation. This is the idea that society as a whole can be surveyed and analyzed by experts for the existence of various disequilibria, which can then be corrected. So you can think of this as the idea that society should be subject to pattern control. Okay? If liberty upsets patterns, it creates messiness. We need actually experts or managers to manipulate society to produce what they consider to be the desirable social pattern. Now, in this kind of society, freedom is threatened in two important ways. The first way that freedom is threatened is through what I call the erasure of the individual. So in this type of society, okay, it's not the preferences of the individual that matter. It's not the values or goals of the individual matter. What matters most of all are social targets or objectives that claim in some sense to represent the well-being of the whole population. Now, let me give you some examples to try to illustrate what I mean by that. Think first of all about macroeconomics. Okay, in most contemporary Western societies or market economies, we take it for granted that we have governments setting growth targets for economic growth. Why? Why do governments concern themselves with the level of economic growth? Some people might want economic growth. Some people might want a lot of economic growth. Other people might not want economic growth. They might want to spend more leisure time. You have some people in the green movement who want degrowth. The idea that there should be some aggregate social position on what the level of growth should be is a kind of taken for granted assumption in these sorts of narratives. But if we're concerned about individual freedom, we should be resisting the idea that there should be growth targets, because it's ignoring the diversity of preferences about the desirable level of growth in the society. Next, take public health. Take disputes about smoking. In my country, and I suspect this is true also in the United States, we have smoking targets. Okay, targets for the number of people who the government decides should or should not be smoking. Now, there are public health risks associated with smoking. Okay? If you're smoking, obviously, there's a risk you pose to yourself, but also a risk you put to other people who you may be smoking in front of. But those risks could be dealt with through private negotiation. You could have no smoking restaurants and smoking restaurants. It's what economists would call cozy and bargaining. But that's not what we see in most of today's societies. We have, you do have that in Lubbock? Oh, well, good for Lubbock, good for Texas. It's not what you see in the UK, and it's certainly not what you see in many other parts of the United States. We actually have targets in the UK for how many people should be smoking. In the same way, we have targets about how big your waistband should be, okay? What the level of obesity or what the level of slimness should be in the society. This is erasing the idea that people might have different preferences about the kind of foods they want to eat, the kind of lifestyles that they want to lead. The next area where we see this process is in discussions around social justice, or notions such as equality, inclusion, and diversity. In these kind of narratives, it's not the experience of individual gay people, or black people, or women, or people of various religious minorities that matter. What matters is how they can be fitted into a particular classificatory scheme to achieve various managerial objectives, which claim that certain representations of particular groups should be present in particular sorts of areas. And that ignores the diversity within those groups, the diversity within the gay community, the female community, the black community, or whatever. You're erasing the individual from view. We also have this in the area of sustainable development, environmental, social governance. The United Nations has got something like 250 sustainable development indicators, which most societies in Western Europe and even the United States have actually signed up to. In this kind of a regime, it's not the actual environment that anybody lives in that matters. It's whether or not your actions can be considered to be delivering some kind of biodiversity target or equivalent. What unites all these examples is that the individual is disappeared. Okay? There's no focus on the individual's preferences or values. It's on a social target rather than on what the individual might want to negotiate for themselves, whether in terms of growth, their health, their understanding of justice, or what kind of environment they want to live in. The next threat to freedom that arises in this kind of regime is what I call the policing of truth. So in these kind of biopolitical states, where there are experts who claim to be able to know society, to survey it, to identify disequilibria, and to correct those disequilibria, there are incentives for those experts to close down the range of acceptable opinion. Why? It's quite simple. If you have too many experts saying too many different things, then it is less likely that people in general are going to take the advice of any particular expert. So if the experts disagree amongst themselves and are seen to be disagreeing amongst themselves, then people will be thinking, well, why can't I choose my own expert? Why do I have to have the expert chosen for me, or have an expert impose their particular view upon me? Now, there are multiple areas where this kind of policing of truth takes place. Think about macroeconomics, again, or the area of financial regulation. This is an area where government agencies, central banks, various financial regulatory authorities are key players, and they are populated by experts who claim to be able to understand the source of various economic malfunctions. Think about what happened after the financial crisis of 2008. a narrative emerged almost immediately after that crisis that this was one of the greatest market failures in human history and that we needed massive new governmental powers to be exercised in liberal market systems to prevent markets from always malfunctioning. Now, that narrative became almost a kind of monopoly position. Okay, there are actually different reasons about, different understandings of why the financial crisis may have happened. There could have been market failures, but there could also have been government failures. Why did the government failure narrative not receive any traction? Well, arguably because the people who are in these agencies have got no interest in speaking about that kind of narrative. They have an interest in perpetuating their own powers and closing down the space within which rival narratives can actually gain some kind of traction. We have the same with public health during the pandemic. There were actually many different views among the public health experts about whether lockdowns were a good idea or a bad idea. But that pluralism of opinion was very quickly closed down. It certainly was in the UK and in much of Western Europe, and I think it was in the United States. And actually, scientists who had been considered leading experts in their field were often cancelled by some of their fellow scientists for not supporting the lockdown regime. This is policing the truth, to create the appearance of a unity which isn't really there in order to bolster the claims of a particular type of expertise. We see this in the area of social justice, with equality, inclusion, and diversity, where instead of recognizing that there's a multitude of different ways that we could try to empower people who historically have been disadvantaged in various ways, instead we have almost a kind of police state developing within institutions like universities that actually impose a sort of party line about the way in which these kind of challenges should be addressed. And then finally, we see the very same type of phenomena in discussions of many environmental challenges. An example I like to use to illustrate this is the attitude of the Green movement towards carbon taxation. Now, I won't get into the details of the arguments for carbon taxes, but if you think that climate change is a problem that needs addressing, there's a strong economic argument for having something like a carbon tax, just as providing a price signal to people to change their behavior. But you then leave it to them to decide how they respond to that price. That is not what most people in the Green movement today want. They don't support carbon taxes. What they want is a moralizing or disciplinary regime where multiple aspects of people's lives are actually policed, where the foods you eat are policed, the travel modes that you take are policed, the shape of your towns and cities are policed. All of these things are policed by experts effectively telling people what kinds of lives they should actually be living. All of these are examples of what I call biopower in today's societies that are gradually, imperceptibly, in multiple different areas, creating, if you like, what Hayek called roads to serfdom. They're not doing it in the way that old school socialism created a road to serfdom, by literally imposing sort of central planning on a whole society. What they're doing is in multiple areas, creating multiple routes for kind of decentralized managerial control over different aspects of people's lives in ways that are increasingly closing down the space for people to exercise their freedom and their agency. So what is to be done about this? What is to be done about this? It's difficult. To some extent, I think you do have to rely on challenges to the regulatory or legalistic framework, which is facilitating this kind of police power, if you like, being exercised in multiple parts of society. But you've got to be very careful in the extent to which you place the emphasis on legislation or deregulation from the top down. Why is that? Because there's a danger of you doing something that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, which is actually reproducing a very particular type of narrative. Okay, it's the idea that people need somebody to liberate them, to make them free, rather than themselves engaging in actions which can, if you like, free themselves. That we shouldn't be relying on a new president or whoever to free us from some of these sorts of controls. You might need to do that to some extent, but you don't want to rely on it, because if you do, you're actually undermining the potential for individuals themselves to take action to resist these kinds of forces. I think what we need, if we're going to challenge the kind of system that is developing in many Western market economies, that is closing down the space for freedom in those economies, is multiple acts of bravery from individual entrepreneurs and people in civil society who are willing to resist, to evade or innovate around the rules and regulations that are being created by those who believe they have the power to direct the future of our societies. That is ultimately, in my view, a postmodern message, and it's a message that supporters of market economies and those who value entrepreneurship should be willing to embrace. Thank you very much.